Eli McGraw had long accepted silence as his only companion, but when he carried a stranger from the storm, the words she whispered shook him deeper than any rifle shot. Eli McGraw had spent too many winters alone to be surprised by much. Yet that morning, when the storm cleared and the snow lay heavy across the ridges, he found himself standing still, with his breath caught in his chest. A shape lay crumpled near the drift, half buried by white, no more than a bundle at first glance. But when he brushed the snow aside, he saw hair bright as a flame, tangled but unmistakable in its color. The woman's face was pale, lips cracked, eyes shut so tight it seemed she was already gone. Yet when Eli pressed 2 fingers to her throat, he felt a faint thrum, fragile as a bird's wing. He did not waste words, for there was no one to hear them, only gathered her up in his arms and turned back toward the line of smoke rising from his cabin. The wind bit his face and the weight of her dragged on his shoulders. But he moved steady, each step breaking through crusted snow, his boots sinking deep, his breath clouding in the cold air. She was light, too light, the bones of her pressing through the thin dress, and he thought of how long she had been lying there, alone in the storm. He tightened his hold, careful not to jostle her too much, as if carrying fire through the storm, something that could flicker out if he was not steady enough. The cabin came into sight, smoke curling from the crooked chimney. He pushed the door open with his boot, stepped inside, and kicked it shut behind him. The warmth inside was thin, only the dying coals of last night's fire glowing red, but it was better than the mountain wind. He laid her down on the narrow bed in the corner, pulled a wool blanket from the peg, and tucked it around her. She did not stir, her face still locked in that strange stillness, but the faint pulse was there. Eli crouched by the hearth, his rough hands feeding sticks and then logs to the fire until the flames rose bright again. He set a pot of water to boil, added dried herbs he had gathered in warmer months, and glanced back at her. The blanket shifted slightly with her shallow breaths. He had not seen another soul in weeks, not since he'd taken his last furs down to the trading post. And now, here was this stranger in his bed, hair burning against the gray light that filtered through the small window. When the tea was ready, he lifted her head carefully, pressing the tin cup to her lips, coaxing a little down her throat. She coughed weakly, a sound that to him felt louder than the crack of a rifle, because it meant she was alive. He sat back on the stool, watching her as the firelight moved across her face, and for the first time in many winters, the silence of the cabin felt less like a weight and more like a waiting breath. The fire had burned steady through the night, its glow painting the rough walls of the cabin in shades of gold and shadow. Eli sat in the old chair by the hearth, his rifle leaned against the wall within reach, his eyes drifting often to the still figure on his bed. The storm outside had eased, leaving the world wrapped in silence, broken only by the pop of resin in the flames. He had not meant to keep watch so long, yet each time he thought to rest his eyes, a fear gnawed at him that if he looked away, the faint thread of her breath would vanish into nothing. She stirred once, turning her head against the pillow, a low sound escaping her lips, and he leaned forward without realizing it, waiting for something more. When morning came, the light spilled pale through the frost-lined window, and with it came a slight shift beneath the blanket. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes clumped with frost that had melted and dried again, and then her eyes opened. They were green, a deep kind of green that made Eli think of the spruce groves down in the valley, and for a moment she only stared at the fire as though it was the first thing she had seen in a long time. He expected fear, a scream, a demand to know where she was or who he was, but instead her lips parted, and she whispered a single word, soft yet clear, safe. Then her eyes closed once more, and she slipped back into sleep. Eli sat frozen, his rough hands gripping the arms of the chair, his heart thudding with an unevenness he had not felt in years. Safe. It was such a small word, but in her voice it carried the weight of a prayer. He had prayed once, long ago, back when his life had other faces in it, before solitude had become the only company he trusted. But no prayer had ever struck him as deep as that word had spoken by a stranger who had nearly died in the snow and now lay beneath his roof. He rubbed his beard with a calloused hand, trying to shake off the strange tightness in his chest. Yet the word echoed again and again in his mind. He rose, moving to check the fire, to busy himself with small tasks, anything to ease the restless feeling. He hung strips of venison near the hearth to soften, poured water from the bucket into a pot, set beans to boil with a pinch of salt. His motions were steady, practiced, but his thoughts kept circling back to her. What had she run from that made her think of safety before anything else? Who had left her to die in the mountains? He did not know, and she had not told him. But her one word spoke of a fear older than the storm itself. As dusk came, he sat again, watching the firelight touch her hair where it spilled bright across the pillow. He thought of how long it had been since another voice had lived inside these walls, how long since he had been more than a shadow moving through empty days. Safe, she had said, and though she had already fallen back into dreams, Eli carried that word like a burden and a blessing both, unsure which it was meant to be. The fire burned low when she stirred again, her eyes opening slow, as if the weight of the world pressed heavy on her lids. Eli was by the table mending a torn sleeve with thread so coarse it could have bound a horse's hoof. But when he heard her shift beneath the blanket, he set the needle aside and turned. She sat up with effort, her hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the quilt, her hair a wild tangle of red falling over her shoulders. He did not speak right away, for he knew words could strike harder than silence, and he had no wish to frighten her. Instead, he poured a tin cup of water, carried it to her, and placed it gently in her hands. She drank slow, her lips cracked, and when she finished, she whispered in a voice still hoarse from the cold, "My name is Cora." It was not much, yet in the quiet cabin it felt like more than a confession. Eli nodded once, not asking more, though 100 questions burned in him. She gave no family name, no town, no reason for being alone in the mountains, only that one word to mark herself, and it was enough. He had lived long enough in solitude to know that when someone gives you their name, it is the only piece of truth they might have left, and it should be taken plain without demand for more. She leaned back against the pillow, her eyes drifting toward the fire, and after a long pause, she whispered again, "I cannot go back." The words hung heavy between them, not as loud as a gunshot, yet carrying the same finality. Eli's jaw tightened, but he made no reply. He knew the kind of weight carried in such a statement. He had left things behind himself, a past that did not deserve retelling, and he had no right to press her for what hers might be. Instead, he went to the hearth, lifted the iron pot, and ladled out a portion of venison stew. The smell of meat and herbs filled the small room, and when he handed her the bowl, she held it as if it were the first kindness she had seen in years. She ate slow, the steam curling around her face, her eyes closing once or twice as if each bite was both comfort and pain. Eli watched from his chair, not staring too long, only enough to see that her color began to return, that her hands steadied as the food filled her. When she finished, she looked at him across the glow of the fire, and for the first time, he caught a glimpse of something not just broken but defiant, still lingering in her gaze. He nodded again, the way men do when words are not needed, and she lowered her eyes back to the bowl. The cabin settled into silence once more, but it was no longer the kind that gnawed at him through the long winters. It was a silence that held space for two souls who knew what it meant to be cast aside by the world and yet still breathe. Eli leaned back, the chair creaking, and thought that perhaps he did not need her story yet. Her name was enough for now, and in this hard land that was more than many ever gave, the nights in the mountains stretched long, the wind curling down from the ridges and rattling the cabin walls as if it meant to pry them apart. Eli had lived through more winters than he cared to count, and he knew the rhythm of them well. But now the rhythm was broken by the soft movements of the woman he had pulled from the snow. She sat close to the fire, her hands outstretched to the flames, the light catching the copper strands of her hair so they glowed like embers themselves. She spoke little, almost nothing, yet her silence did not weigh on him the way other silences had. She seemed to fill the space with her very being, and Eli, who had once thought he had forgotten how to watch anyone, found his eyes straying to her again and again. One evening she pulled his old wooden comb from the shelf where it had sat untouched for years. She ran it through her tangled hair, slow and careful, wincing when the teeth caught on the knots. The sound of it scraping through the strands filled the cabin, small but steady, and Eli sat in his chair with his pipe cold, forgetting even to light it. He watched her as if watching something he had no right to, like a ghost who had taken flesh and sat by his fire. She did not ask him if she could use it, did not offer thanks, but he did not mind. The comb had belonged to his mother long ago, carried west when she followed his father into the unknown. And though Eli had not touched it in years, seeing it in Cora's hands felt less like theft and more like remembrance. She ate what food he placed before her: venison stew, beans, bread, rough as bark, never complaining, never asking for more. At night she curled beneath the blanket he had given, the quilt patched with pieces of old coats, her breath slow and even. Sometimes Eli would wake to the hiss of wind outside and find himself listening for the sound of her breathing, steadying himself by its presence. He told himself it was only caution, the way a man watches the flame of a lantern, to be sure it does not die out. Yet in truth, he feared both her leaving and her staying. Cora did not pry into his life, did not ask why he lived alone in the shadow of the mountains. He offered no stories, and she seemed content not to hear them. They shared little more than glances across the firelight, small nods when one passed the other a dish, or when she stirred the pot at his silent request. Still, those quiet gestures bound them in a way Eli could not explain. Each night, as shadows stretched tall on the cabin walls, and the fire whispered low, Eli sat with the strange feeling that something had shifted in him. He was half afraid she would vanish come morning, swallowed by snow as if she had never been, and half afraid she would stay and undo the lonely order he had built. Yet still he watched, and still she sat by the fire, her presence both a wound and a balm. The snow lay heavy around the cabin, soft on top but crusted beneath, the kind of snow that carried prints for days. Eli stepped outside that morning with his axe, meaning to split a few more logs before the sun dipped, and he saw them right away. Hoofprints, deep and fresh, pressed into the whiteness less than 20 yards from the door. He crouched down, brushing aside the thin drift that had begun to cover them, and felt the chill settle deeper into his bones. There were 3, maybe 4 riders, not passing through but circling slow, the pattern of the tracks showing hesitation, searching, as though they knew someone was here, but hadn't yet found the nerve to knock on the door. He stood still for a long moment, his breath clouding in the frozen air, his eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved now, no figures against the ridge, no sound but the moan of wind through the pines. But the tracks spoke loud enough. Whoever they were, they had come close and left, maybe meaning to return when dark fell. Eli straightened, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle, and turned back to the cabin. Inside, Cora was at the table, her hair pulled loose over one shoulder, mending one of his torn shirts with thread too coarse for her thin fingers. When she looked up and saw his face, she knew before he spoke. Her body stiffened, her eyes darting to the door, then to the small window where the snow glare poured in. She said nothing, not a word, but Eli caught the flicker in her gaze, the way her lips parted, as if a secret pressed hard against them. He didn't need to ask. The truth was already in her silence. He set the rifle on the table, close enough for her to see, and moved toward the fire to stir the pot simmering there. He did not speak of the tracks, nor ask who might leave them, because the way her hands trembled over the cloth told him enough. Whoever she had fled from was not far, and she carried the weight of knowing it. The day passed slow, each sound sharper than it ought to be. The crack of the fire startled her. The creak of the chair pulled her eyes to the door. Eli worked as he always did, chopping wood, checking traps, skinning a hare by the block outside. But his senses sharpened too. He watched the horizon, listened for hooves on the frozen ground, and kept his rifle near. When dusk came, the light fading pink against the peaks, he found her standing at the window, her hands pressed flat to the sill, her shoulders taut as a bowstring. She turned when he stepped near, her eyes wide but steady, and whispered, barely more than breath, "They'll come back." Eli did not flinch, did not press her further. He only gave a slow nod, his face calm though his chest burned with the truth of it. Whoever hunted her was close, and the mountain silence would not hold them off forever. The nights grew longer after he found the tracks, each one stretching out like a question he could not answer. Eli sat by the fire and thought of spring, of the thaw that would open the river and make travel easier, of the towns below where lawmen kept their watch, and where a woman like Cora might find shelter. He pictured her walking through the doors of a church, her hair catching the light of stained glass, her shoulders easing for the first time in years. He told himself that would be best, safer than the hard life of the mountains, safer than living in a cabin where men might ride up at any hour with rope or iron in hand. But when he looked across the flames and saw her curled in the chair, the quilt draped around her shoulders, her face calm in the glow, the thought of sending her away twisted something deep inside him. He had lived too many winters with nothing but silence to answer him, and now here she was whispering life into the cabin with the smallest of gestures. He had meant to keep his world simple, trap the ridges, trade at the post, speak no more than a dozen words to anyone, yet the moment she opened her eyes and whispered safe, it had all begun to change. He tried to reason with himself, saying it was not his place to keep her, that he had no right to tie her fate to his, but that word would not let him go. Safe. She had spoken it again one night, when the wind howled against the shutters, and he thought she slept. He had stirred, reaching to lay another log on the fire, and her voice came soft from the bed. Safe. Just the one word, no more. But it rooted in him deeper than any vow. Eli lay awake long after, staring at the beams of the roof, feeling the truth pressed down on him. If he sent her downriver, he would be doing what he told himself was wise, but it would be a lie to her. She had trusted him, not the men in uniforms who measured worth by coin or name. To her the word had meant this place, this roof, this fire, and him. Letting her go would be a kind of betrayal he could not stomach. The danger of keeping her was plain. He did not need reminding. Tracks did not vanish in snow. Men who hunted rarely forgot, and trouble had a way of finding its mark. Yet when he watched her stir the pot of beans with quiet hands, or comb her hair in the firelight, he knew danger had already found him. He no longer lived only for himself. He was tied now, whether by choice or by fate. He sat at the table, sharpening his knife, slow and steady, while Cora hummed soft by the fire. He thought of what it meant to stay, what it meant to fight for something instead of watching it slip away. And as the steel rang against stone, he understood that sending her off would be the easier path, but not the honest one. He would keep her, whatever the cost. The storm came down from the north without warning, a white wall swallowing the peaks and ridges until the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. Snow drove against the windows, piling high against the door, the wind shrieking through every crack as if it meant to tear the place apart. Eli had known storms like this before, and he knew there was no point in fighting them. He barred the door with a plank, stacked wood high by the hearth, and settled in to wait. Cora stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow lash across the glass before she turned and drew closer to the fire, pulling the quilt tight around her shoulders. The first night passed in restless silence, the storm's fury never easing. Eli sat in his chair with his pipe cold, staring into the flames, while Cora curled on the bed, her face half hidden by the blanket. By morning the snow was piled to the sill, the door frozen shut, and the cabin felt more like a buried cave than a shelter. Yet inside the fire kept them warm, and there was food enough, dried meat and beans and flour for bread. On the second day, she rose from the bed and asked without words if she might take up his coat. It hung on a peg by the door, its sleeve ripped near the shoulder, the hide worn thin. Eli watched as she threaded a needle with careful hands and began to mend the tear. She hummed as she worked, not loud, not meant for him, but soft as the sound of water running under ice. Eli had not heard such a sound in years, and it struck him quiet. He pretended to busy himself, splitting, kindling, and tending the stew, yet all the while his ears strained for that faint tune. By the third day the storm still howled outside, but something inside had changed. The cabin no longer pressed in on him with its silence. The firelight threw shadows across the walls, the smell of venison stew hung in the air, and her quiet humming wove through it like thread binding the place together. She looked up once, catching his eyes as he sat sharpening a blade, and for the first time since she had come she smiled. It was a small thing, quick as a spark, but it left him feeling as though the cabin had grown larger, filled with a warmth he had thought lost forever. When night came, she draped the mended coat across his chair. He touched the stitches, neat and steady, and for a moment he could not speak. He only nodded, his throat tight, and she lowered her gaze back to the fire. Outside, the wind still screamed, rattling the walls, but inside Eli felt a peace he had not known in years. The cabin was no longer a prison of solitude, but a place where life stirred again, fragile yet real. For the first time he did not dread the storm's hold, for in its fury he had found shelter of another kind. The storm had passed, but the air outside was still sharp as glass, the kind that cut through hide and cloth without mercy. Inside the cabin the fire kept steady, and the smell of stew lingered, and Eli thought perhaps the worst had eased for a time. Cora sat close to the flames, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, the mended coat folded neatly on the chair between them. She had been quiet all morning, quieter than usual, her hands twisting in her lap as though some weight pressed too heavy for silence alone to carry. Eli did not ask, for he was not a man who asked, but when she finally spoke her voice cut through the room like the crack of a branch in the woods. She said she had been sold. The words came without flourish, flat and plain, but Eli felt them hit like a hammer all the same. She said there was a man in town, a gambler with money and fists, who had taken her as if she were nothing more than property. She said he bought her, used her, and when she did not please him, he struck her down until she thought she would die. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fire as she told it, her voice steady though her hands trembled. She did not weep, for tears had long ago dried out of her. But Eli saw the way her shoulders bent under the memory, the way her mouth tightened around the words as if each one burned. He sat still in his chair, his jaw clenched so hard it ached, his hand curled into a fist against his knee. Yet he made no sound, for fear that if he opened his mouth, it would not be words that came out, but the roar of a man who had lived too long with his anger buried deep. His silence was not dismissal, not disinterest, but the only way he knew to keep the fury from spilling over. He kept his eyes on her, steady and unblinking, and when she finally dared to look at him, she seemed to understand. She told him she had run on a night when she thought her body would break apart from the blows, when the gambler's laughter had followed her out into the dark. She had run without cloak or horse, without food, only the thought that anything was better than dying beneath his hand. The snow had nearly finished what he started, but she had kept moving until her legs failed and the mountain took her down. Then she had woken to firelight and his face above her, rough and weathered, but not cruel. Eli leaned forward, setting another log on the fire, though it did not need one. The flames leapt higher, sparks rushing up the chimney. He could not undo what she had lived through, could not strike down the memory, but he could listen, and he could let her see in his eyes that she was no longer alone. She looked back at the fire, her voice lowering, and said she could never return. He gave one slow nod, his silence holding all the words he could not shape. And in that moment, she knew his anger was not for her, but for the man who had made her run. The thaw had not yet come, but the snow had thinned in patches, leaving dark earth showing along the ridges and a damp chill rising with each dawn. Eli had taken to walking the high ground above the cabin, scanning the valley for movement, his rifle always slung across his shoulder. He trusted the mountains to guard him most days. But ever since Cora had spoken of the gambler, he had felt the weight of waiting, as if trouble was climbing the same slopes with slow and patient steps. That morning, with the sun cutting pale through the mist, he saw them, 3 riders, dark against the whiteness, winding up the trail with purpose. Their coats flapped in the wind, rifles across their backs, their horses laboring through the drifts. Eli crouched low on the ridge, the rifle firm in his hands, his eyes narrowing as he watched. These were not hunters or traders. Their movement was too careful, too measured, like men with a task they meant to finish. He counted their number, watched how they spread slightly apart, not close enough to be caught in one shot. They rode like men used to trouble. He felt his jaw tighten. He had lived long enough to know what it meant when riders came looking, and he knew even longer what it meant to let them succeed. The cabin lay quiet below, smoke drifting from its chimney, Cora inside with no notion that eyes were set upon her. Eli thought of her sitting by the fire, her red hair catching the glow, her voice whispering safe as if it were a prayer meant only for the walls around them. He thought of how she had run, how she had nearly died in the snow to escape chains of a different kind. And the thought of those men riding her back down the mountain into the gambler's hands made something dark settle hard in his chest. He could take the shot now, end one of them before they reached the bend, but the sound would carry and bring the others down on him. He could wait until night, slip through the trees, and drive them off like wolves from a camp. Or he could walk away, let them do as they pleased, tell himself it was not his fight, but that last thought was nothing but a lie. He knew it even as it crossed his mind. The moment he carried her from the snow, the moment she breathed the word safe in his cabin, she had become his fight. Eli lowered himself against the rock, steadying his breath, the rifle resting across his knees. He would not let them drag her back. He had killed before, men and beasts alike, when the land gave him no choice, and he would do it again if the world pressed him. His silence was the only prayer he offered, and it was a promise as well. Below, the riders pressed on, unaware that the mountain already watched them. And in that stillness, Eli made his choice. The night before was heavy with silence, the kind that settles before a storm, though no snow was falling. Cora sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin cup, her eyes restless on the door. Eli said nothing, only cleaned his rifle with the slow patience of a man who knew what morning would bring. He had seen the riders circling lower on the trail, had counted their number again, and he knew they would come with first light when the shadows were long and the cold cut hardest. He sharpened his knife, checked the powder, and laid everything within reach. She whispered his name once, low, as if she meant to beg him to run, but he only shook his head. The mountain had kept him too long to make him a man who fled. When dawn came, the world was washed in pale blue, the snow crusted hard enough to bear weight without sinking. Eli was already outside, crouched behind a drift, his breath misting in front of him. The men rode up the trail slow and steady, their rifles ready, their eyes scanning the cabin as wolves watch a pen. Eli felt no rush of fear, only a calm that came from knowing the line had been drawn and there was no turning from it. The first shot cracked through the cold, sharp as a breaking branch. It came from one of the riders, a warning perhaps, but Eli answered without hesitation. His rifle roared, and one man dropped from his horse, the beast screaming as it bolted. The others shouted, scattering wide, firing into the snow, their bullets slicing the drift around him. Eli shifted position, moved low and quick, firing again, the kick of the rifle steady in his shoulder. He thought of nothing but the words she had spoken, safe, and each shot was a promise to guard it. Cora was inside, crouched by the hearth, her hands clutched tight around the coat she had mended for him, listening to the gunfire shatter the morning. She pressed her lips to the fabric, praying without words that he would not fall, that the mountain would keep him. Outside, the fight dragged on, smoke rising thin in the cold air, the snow churned by hooves and blood. Eli fought like a man who had nothing left to lose but the fragile gift he had been given. He knew the cost of killing, knew the weight it put on a man's soul, but he carried it without flinching. When it ended, the light had risen full across the ridge. 3 men lay in the snow, their blood staining the white drifts, their horses scattered down the trail. The last rider fled, his shouts echoing faint until silence returned. Eli stood still, his rifle smoking in his hands, his breath heavy but steady. He looked across the field of snow, the red stark against the white, and then back at the cabin where he knew she waited. The mountains were quiet again, holding the dead in their cold embrace, and Eli felt the silence settle deep. He had stood for her, and though the blood on the snow would not vanish, neither would the word she had given him. Safe. The fight had left its mark on him, though he stood straight when he came through the door. Cora saw the blood before he said a word, dark against his shirt where the fabric had torn, the red spreading slow from a crease along his shoulder. He leaned the rifle against the wall and sank into the chair, his breath heavy but his eyes steady. She did not cry out, did not scold, only fetched the basin and cloth, her hands trembling a little as she dipped the rag into warm water and pressed it gently against the wound. He hissed under his breath but did not pull away. The fire snapped in the hearth, the smell of smoke thick in the air, and between them there was no need for talk. She worked with care, dabbing the blood, tearing strips from an old shirt to bind him. Her hands were small against his broad frame, yet each touch carried a weight that steadied him more than the bandages. He watched her face as she bent close, the firelight shining on the strands of her hair, and he thought of how close he had come to never seeing it again. When she tied the cloth tight, she glanced up, meeting his eyes for a moment, and though no words were spoken, the truth passed between them. She would not ask if he regretted killing. He would not ask if she planned to leave. Some things were too plain to waste on questions. When the wound was tended, she rose and moved to the small shelf, pulling down a crust of bread she had baked the day before. She cut it with his knife, set it on the table, and poured water into 2 cups. The simple act filled the room more than any feast might have. She placed 1 piece of bread before him, kept the other for herself, and sat across from him as if she had done so 100 times before. He watched the way she broke her piece slow, chewing in silence, her eyes calm now that the danger had passed. The cabin, once so empty, now felt shaped around her presence. Eli ate with his good hand, his movements careful, his gaze never straying far from her. He had thought once that he was built for solitude, that the mountains were enough to hold him, but now he saw the lie of it. The room had been nothing more than timber and stone until she had stepped inside. Now, as she sat across from him, it felt less like a shelter against storms and more like the heart of something that might last. She rose again after they finished, gathering the plates, humming under her breath as she rinsed them in the basin. Eli leaned back, listening, his eyes half closed, his body tired but his chest light in a way he had not known in years. When she was done, she folded the cloth, set it aside, and returned to her seat, her hands folded on the table. She did not ask permission to stay, nor did she promise she would. She simply sat there, her presence steady, as though she had always belonged in that chair across from him. The mountains shifted with the seasons, their ridges turning from white to green and back again, the streams swelling with spring melt, then shrinking to a trickle under the summer Sunday. Through it all, the cabin stood steady, no longer just Eli's shelter, but something fuller, something different. The walls that once held only silence now carried the sound of her voice humming as she kneaded bread, the scrape of her comb through her hair, the soft laugh that slipped out when she caught him watching her from the doorway. The garden he had once left to weeds now grew strong under her hands. rows of beans and corn stretching up toward the light, her red hair bending over the soil each morning, as if she had been born to make life spring out of the hard earth. Eli found himself moving through his days with a steadiness that felt new. He still rose before dawn to check his traps, still split wood and mended tools, but there was no longer the hollow drag to his chores. Each task was a piece of a life that was no longer only his. When he carried a deer home on his shoulders, she met him at the door with a smile, her hands reaching to take the knife and help dress it. When storms rolled down from the peaks, she lit the lamps and waited by the fire. And when he stepped inside dripping snow, she set warm stew before him without a word, her presence more welcome than any comfort he had ever known. He had thought once that solitude was all he deserved, that the past he had left behind marked him as a man meant to live out his days with no voice but his own. Yet with her in the cabin, the weight of those years seemed to lift, replaced by something he could not quite name. He did not need to. Each evening when she sat across from him, the fire painting her face in gold, he knew the meaning without words. It was on a night when the first snow of winter came again, drifting soft against the window, that the truth settled between them. They sat at the table, the day's work behind them, bread cooling on the board, and the fire glowing steady. She reached across, her hand small against his rough one, and touched him gently as though the act itself was fragile. Her eyes met his, steady and sure, and she whispered one word, home. The sound of it moved through him like a river breaking ice. He, who had thought the mountains would take him alone and silent, felt the years fall away in that single breath. He closed his hand around hers, rough fingers wrapping firm, and whispered it back. Home. The word lingered in the air, not loud, not long, but enough to bind them. Outside the snow kept falling, but inside the cabin there was warmth, laughter, and a peace he had never believed he would find. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.